Lingchi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, stands as one of the most infamous punishments in world history. The very phrase conjures images of unimaginable suffering. A drawn-out execution where the victim's body is slowly dismantled. But behind the legend of Lingchi lies a complex system of law, ritual, and social meaning in Imperial China. It was never just about killing someone. It was about destroying their body, their honor, and their memory in a way that extended punishment far beyond the grave. The origins of Lingchi stretch back to the early dynasties of China, with the first clear mentions appearing during the Song dynasty in the 10th and 11th centuries. It was a punishment reserved for crimes considered especially heinous: treason, parricide, severe acts of rebellion, and desecrations of social order. These were not ordinary offenses. They were crimes that, in the eyes of the state, tore apart the moral and political fabric of society. For such criminals, a swift beheading was too merciful. They required a punishment that would mark them not only in life but also in death. A punishment that would serve as an unforgettable warning to everyone who witnessed it. The procedure of Lingchi was not a chaotic bloodbath but a ritualized act, bound up with legal codes and ceremonial steps. The condemned would be bound to a wooden frame or post, exposed to the view of officials and often to large crowds of onlookers. Executioners were trained not just in killing, but in prolonging the process. Using sharp knives, they would cut pieces of flesh from the body in a prescribed sequence: the arms, the chest, the thighs, before finally delivering a fatal blow, often to the heart or by decapitation. The goal was not necessarily to kill the victim through the cuts themselves, but to humiliate and degrade them in front of all. Over time, the exact number of cuts became a subject of exaggeration and myth. Western travelers and later historians spoke of thousands of cuts, but the truth is more complicated. Surviving Chinese accounts suggest that the number varied, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, depending on the crime, the skill of the executioner, and the legal instructions given. What mattered was not the literal count, but the symbolic meaning. The idea of fragmentation, of being cut apart piece by piece, physically and morally erased. For Chinese culture steeped in Confucian traditions, the destruction of the body carried a particularly heavy weight to the Confucian mind. The body was a sacred gift from one's parents and ancestors. To mutilate it was a deep violation, and to lose it dishonorably was to disgrace not only oneself but one's entire lineage. Lingchi struck at the heart of this belief system. It did not merely end a life, it corrupted the body, depriving the condemned of the possibility of burial as an intact being, and therefore of honor in the afterlife. In this way, Lingchi extended punishment beyond the individual into the realm of family, memory, and spiritual destiny. The spectacle of Lingchi was carefully staged to maximize its effect. Official accounts show that executions were carried out in public squares, often with large audiences. The crowd was not just present for curiosity, they were participants in the ritual of state power. Watching a traitor, a parricide, or a criminal of extreme offense being cut apart reaffirmed the authority of the emperor and the law. The act was both a warning and a lesson. This is what awaits those who betray family, society, or throne. But Lingchi was also a punishment of shame. Records indicate that families of the condemned often face stigma, stripped of titles, privileges, or even property. The disgrace of Lingchi spread outward, staining entire households. Just as the condemned body was cut into pieces, so too was the family's honor fragmented. The punishment did not stop at the scaffold. It reverberated into the social fabric, ensuring the memory of the crime and of the criminal would endure in disgrace. Foreign observers who encountered Lingchi were both horrified and fascinated. Jesuit missionaries in the Ming and Qing dynasties, for example, wrote accounts that emphasized the gruesomeness of the punishment, portraying China as barbaric to European audiences. Later, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, photographs of Lingchi executions began circulating in the West. These images, often taken by French or British soldiers during China's turbulent late Imperial period, shocked and appalled foreign audiences. They showed bound men in the process of dismemberment, faces twisted in agony, executioners carrying out precise cuts. For many in Europe, these photos became enduring symbols of Chinese cruelty, even though, by that point, Lingchi was already falling out of favor within China itself. One of the most famous images of Lingchi was taken in 1905, during one of the last recorded executions of this kind. It showed a man accused of murdering his master being slowly cut apart before death. The photograph traveled across the world, appearing in books, exhibitions, and even medical studies, where it was sometimes used to analyze the expressions of pain and ecstasy. For Western readers, it confirmed stereotypes of Oriental despotism. For Chinese reformers, it became a rallying point, a symbol of practices that needed to be abolished in order to modernize. Yet it would be wrong to reduce Lingchi only to its sensational horror. Within China, it carried a distinct legal and moral logic. It was not an everyday punishment. It was reserved for extraordinary crimes. The legal codes of the Ming and Qing dynasties detail the circumstances under which it could be applied, and those circumstances were always tied to ideas of betrayal. Betrayal of family, of loyalty, of the emperor. Lingchi was, in that sense, a punishment for disloyalty itself, a way of showing that betrayal would tear a person apart, body and soul. As time went on, however, the practice became increasingly criticized within China itself. Reformers, especially during the late Qing period, saw it as a barbaric relic, something that undermined China's standing in the modern world. The final years of Lingchi coincided with a moment of great upheaval in Chinese society as the empire confronted foreign powers, internal rebellions, and pressures to modernize its legal system. In 1905, the very year the famous photograph was taken, the Qing government officially abolished Lingchi. It was the end of a practice that had lasted for centuries, but its memory had already secured a place in both Chinese and global imagination. Even today, the phrase "death by 1,000 cuts" lives on as a metaphor. It is used to describe slow destruction, incremental suffering, or the cumulative effect of small harms. The term has moved far beyond its original context, but its power endures because of the haunting reality behind it. The idea that a human being could be dismantled piece by piece for the sake of law and spectacle still shocks us centuries later. Lingchi's abolition in 1905 was more than just the end of a gruesome execution. It represented a turning point in China's relationship with its own traditions and its place in the world. The Qing dynasty, battered by internal strife and foreign humiliation, sought to modernize and present itself as a civilized nation in the eyes of Europe and Japan. Ending Lingchi was both a practical legal reform and a symbolic gesture. By removing what had become notorious worldwide, the king signaled its willingness to abandon older, ritualized punishments in favor of more standardized and rational methods such as decapitation or shooting. But the legacy of Lingchi did not vanish with its abolition. It had already entered the cultural imagination, not just in China, but globally. Westerners saw it as a grotesque curiosity, something that embodied their own notions of Eastern cruelty. In contrast, within China, it became a site of memory, often used by reformers and intellectuals as proof of the urgent need for progress. For writers like Lu Xun in the early 20th century, images of Lingchi symbolized the sickness of the old order, the cruelty of a system that crushed the individual in the name of authority. The symbolism of Lingchi also reached into philosophy and politics. In Michel Foucault's famous work Discipline and Punish, he referenced the practice in order to show the way. Societies once made punishment a public spectacle. For Foucault, Lingchi was not just an execution method, but an emblem of how power used the body to demonstrate control. The slow destruction of flesh illustrated the logic of sovereign punishment, to mark and shatter the offender in plain view, so that the act of justice became theater. Yet beyond the philosophy, beyond the stereotypes and foreign interpretations. Lingchi was grounded in a cultural and legal reality for centuries. Chinese law was deeply moral in character, blending Confucian ethics with strict codes of imperial authority. Crimes were not only about actions but about relationships between ruler and subject, child and parent, servant and master. To violate these bonds was to unravel the order of the world. In such a system, a punishment like Lingchi was more than cruelty. It was a statement. That betrayal itself would be met with fragmentation, erasure, and disgrace. Still, the horror of the practice cannot be dismissed. The physical suffering, the psychological torment of being cut apart while alive, the public gaze of thousands of onlookers, all of this combined into an ordeal that must have been unbearable for the condemned. Eyewitness descriptions speak of victims screaming, fainting, or even falling into shock long before the final cut. Executioners sometimes administered opium to dull the pain, not out of mercy but to prolong the procedure. The idea was never just to kill. It was to stage a death that communicated shame, pain, and dishonor. The endurance of Lingchi in historical memory owes much to the haunting photographs and reports of its last decades. These images circulated at a time when the world was already beginning to embrace modern photography, and they became some of the first visual records of extreme punishment to reach global audiences. Like descriptions in books, photographs seemed irrefutable, undeniable evidence of cruelty. They provoked outrage, disgust, and morbid fascination, and they gave Lingchi a visibility that few ancient punishments have ever achieved. For modern readers, these images and accounts raise unsettling questions. Why did societies once create punishments designed not only to kill but to degrade? What does it say about human culture that spectacle, pain, and shame could be combined into ritualized executions? And perhaps most importantly, how different are we really today? While Lingchi may seem like a relic of a distant past, echoes of its logic survive in the modern world. Public shaming, symbolic punishments, and the use of suffering as a deterrent are not gone. Even without knives or scaffolds, societies continue to wield the body and the image of pain as tools of authority. Lingchi endures as a mirror, showing us not only what Imperial China once did, but what humans in all times and places are capable of when law, morality, and spectacle converge. In the end, Lingchi was more than just death by 1,000 cuts. It was an entire system of meaning. It punished betrayal, enforced loyalty, and terrified communities into obedience. It marked the condemned as beyond redemption, stripping them of dignity in both life and death. And though it was abolished over a century ago, its memory remains, carried in words, images, and metaphors that still shape how we think about suffering, justice, and power. As we reflect on Lingchi today, we see both the brutality of the past and the ways in which punishment has always been about more than retribution. It has been about control, theater, and the shaping of collective fear. That is why the story of Lingchi endures, not just as a gruesome execution, but as a lesson about the deep entanglement of law, culture, and violence. And now, when we hear the phrase death by 1,000 cuts, we understand the weight it carries. It is not just a metaphor for small harms accumulating into destruction. It is the echo of a real practice, one that once defined the limits of punishment in Imperial China, and one that still speaks to our collective imagination of cruelty. If you found this exploration of Lingchi thought-provoking and want to uncover more about the world, as dark as punishments, brutal laws, and forgotten histories, make sure to follow, share, and join us on this journey into humanity's shadowed past. History is not always glorious. Sometimes it is horrifying, but in facing it, we see ourselves more clearly.